The Riot the system never admitted what really happened at Attica prison. Frank, Big Black, Smith lay face down in the dirt of the yard, his hands covering his head as bullets tore through the air above him. White gas clouds swirled around bodies sprawled across the concrete. Blood pooled near his face. A helicopter thundered overhead, and through the chaos, he heard his friend Tommy's voice, weak and desperate. "Big Black, they're shooting everyone." Frank turned his head just enough to see Tommy's eyes, wide with disbelief, with the realization that after 4 days of holding hostages without harming them, after protecting the guards they'd captured, the state of New York had decided to kill them all anyway. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. 4 days earlier, Frank stood in the breakfast line at Attica Correctional Facility like he did every morning. At 21 years old, 6'2" and 240 pounds, Frank had earned his nickname and the respect that came with it. Inmates stepped aside when he walked through. Guards knew he kept the peace. He wasn't a troublemaker, just doing his 5 to 15 for robbery, keeping his head down. His cellmate Tommy shuffled beside him, talking about his parole hearing scheduled for next month. 1 month, Black. 30 more days, and I'm seeing my daughter again. Frank nodded, grabbing his tray of cold oatmeal. Then Lieutenant Curtis screamed at an inmate who'd dropped his tray, slamming his baton against the metal table. Frank watched the rage flash across the faces of men around him, men who'd been swallowing this kind of treatment for years. Frank was walking back from breakfast when he saw it happen. In the A-block corridor, four guards surrounded 2 inmates, Leroy Dewar and another man Frank didn't know. Batons rose and fell. The sound of wood hitting flesh echoed off the concrete walls. Leroy's head snapped back, blood spraying from his nose. Frank stopped walking. Every instinct told him to help, but helping meant additional charges, more time, further from freedom. Other inmates gathered, a crowd forming. Their breathing changed, sharp, angry, dangerous. "Get back to your cells now," a guard shouted, but nobody moved. Frank saw it in their eyes, the thing he'd seen building for months. Something was about to break. The guards dragged Leroy and the other inmate away, leaving blood smeared across the floor. Frank stood there long after everyone else had gone, staring at those blood streaks, knowing they'd just crossed some invisible line. The recreation yard buzzed with whispered conversations. Frank sat on a bench while his friend L.D. Barkley, an educated man, the kind who read law books and knew words like habeas corpus, explained their rights as human beings. "They can't treat us like this, Black. We got rights." Over 1,500 men were packed into Attica, living conditions straight out of the medieval times. 1 shower per week, 1 roll of toilet paper per month. Food so rotten you could smell it going bad. Frank had learned to live with it, convinced himself he could do his time and get out. But LD's words planted seeds. "I can do my time," Frank said quietly. "But this ain't human." That's when the news spread through the yard like electricity. Those beaten inmates had been thrown into solitary confinement. No medical treatment, just darkness and concrete. Men started gathering in clusters, their voices rising. Frank heard fragments. "Something has to change. Can't let them keep doing this. If not now, when?" Frank was walking back to his cell block when the world exploded. Inmates from A block rushed the metal gate, bodies slamming against steel until something gave way. The gate broke open with a screech that sounded like freedom itself. Hundreds of men poured through the gap, flooding into the tunnels that connected the cell blocks. Frank froze at the intersection. Behind him was safety, his cell, his routine, his path to parole. Ahead was chaos and probably more prison time. Tommy grabbed his arm. "Frank, we gotta move. Now or never." Through the crowd, Frank saw a guard beating another inmate with his baton, the same casual violence he'd witnessed that morning. Something inside Frank snapped. He ran forward, joining the rush of bodies. They stormed through tunnels, overwhelming guards, liberating cell blocks one after another. Keys jingled as cell doors flew open. Men who'd been locked in boxes for months stumbled into the light. The entire prison was coming apart, and Frank was right in the middle of it. The yard filled with thousands of inmates, a sea of blue uniforms and raised fists. Frank stood in the center of controlled chaos, watching men run in every direction. Somewhere in this madness, organization had to emerge or people would die. "Get the injured over here," Frank shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. Men responded, dragging wounded inmates and guards to a clear space. 42 correction officers had been captured during the takeover. They huddled together, terrified, some bleeding from the initial struggle. Frank saw an inmate raising a pipe above a guard's head. "Stop!" Frank grabbed the man's arm. "We touched them. We're dead. They're our insurance." The inmate spat, but lowered the pipe. Frank positioned himself between the hostages and the crowd, making it clear anyone wanting to hurt these guards would have to go through Big Black first. Leaders emerged from the chaos. L.D. Barkley stepped forward as spokesman. He had the words, the education, the voice they needed. Frank became head of security because men listened when he spoke and backed down when he stood his ground. They formed a committee, making decisions quickly. "We need these guards alive," Frank told the group. "They're scared human beings, just like us. Anyone touches them answers to me personally." He organized inmates into shifts, creating a protective circle around the hostages. Tommy helped, positioning trusted men at key points. Frank brought water to the guards, had someone with medical knowledge check their injuries. One guard, a young kid, maybe 23 years old, looked up at Frank with wet eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Frank nodded. "Just stay calm. Nobody's dying today if I can help it." Frank stood behind L.D. Barkley as his friend read their demands to Commissioner Oswald through the fence. 28 demands total. Minimum wage for prison work. Religious freedom. Better food. The right to shower more than once a week. Basic human dignity. Frank listened to each one, thinking, these aren't demands. These are things free men take for granted. Commissioner Oswald's voice crackled through a megaphone. "We'll talk tomorrow. Let's all stay calm." Frank scanned the rooftops and saw them, state troopers positioning themselves, rifles visible against the darkening sky. He nudged Tommy. "See that? They're already planning to come in." Tommy followed his gaze. "We got hostages. They won't risk it." Frank wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe human life, guard or inmate, mattered to the people pointing those rifles. But looking at those dark shapes on the rooftops, he felt cold certainty settling into his bones. Frank patrolled the yard through the first night, keeping order while 1,200 men tried to sleep on concrete. Makeshift tents rose from bedsheets. Small fires burned for warmth. It looked like a refugee camp, which in a way it was, refugees from the hell of normal Attica operations. Frank found a young inmate crying behind one of the tents. The kid couldn't have been more than 18. "What's your name?" Frank asked gently. "Carlos," the kid choked out. "I've only been here a month. I just want to see my mother again." Frank sat beside him, his massive frame somehow comforting. "We're gonna get out of this, kid. Stay close to me, understand? I'll keep you safe." Carlos nodded, wiping his eyes. Frank looked around at the yard, at all these men who just wanted to be treated like human beings. He spotted the hostages in their protected area, guards watching over them. Everything felt suspended between hope and disaster. Frank woke to Tommy shaking his shoulder. "Black, look." Outside observers were arriving, journalists with cameras, lawyers in suits, even Bobby Seale from the Black Panther Party. News helicopters circled overhead. The whole world was watching. L.D. Barkley stood before the observers, speaking with an eloquence that made Frank's chest swell with pride. "We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. What has happened here is but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed." Frank watched his friend command attention, transform a prison riot into a human rights movement. Then he saw 3 inmates circling the hostages with angry expressions. Frank moved quickly, intercepting them. "Walk away. Now." The largest one stepped forward. "They beat us for years, Black." Frank didn't blink. "And we're better than them. That's the point. Walk away." They walked away. Frank was making rounds when LD pulled him aside, face grave. "Guard William Quinn, the one injured during the initial rush. He's in the hospital. Critical condition." Frank's stomach dropped. He hadn't hurt Quinn personally, had been trying to stop violence, but they'd all been part of the takeover. "If he dies." Frank couldn't finish the sentence. "If he dies," LD said quietly, "they'll charge everyone in this yard with murder." Frank looked around at the 1,200 faces. At Carlos helping distribute food. At Tommy organizing the security rotation. At men who just wanted better conditions and now might face murder charges. He didn't tell anyone else yet. No point spreading panic. But Frank understood something with absolute clarity. The state was waiting for an excuse, and Guard Quinn might be it. Every hour that passed, he felt the noose tightening around all of them. Commissioner Oswald sat across the negotiating table from the inmate committee. Frank stood behind LD, watching every facial expression, every gesture. Oswald slid a document across the table. 28 of your 31 demands. In writing. Sign. LD read through it carefully, then looked up. And amnesty? Oswald's face hardened. I can't guarantee complete amnesty for the riot itself. That's up to the governor and the courts. The table fell silent. LD's voice dropped low. Without amnesty, Commissioner, we're dead men the moment we surrender. You know what they'll do to us. Oswald stood. I'm sorry. Governor Rockefeller refuses to come here personally, refuses to grant blanket amnesty. This is the best I can offer. As he walked away, Frank exchanged looks with Tommy. They both understood. The state was stalling, positioning, preparing for an assault. 28 concessions meant nothing if they'd all be dead or tortured afterward. Frank and Tommy sat against the wall, speaking in low voices while the yard settled into its second night. They're gonna come in shooting, Frank said. That's why Rockefeller won't come. He doesn't want to look us in the eye before he gives the order. Tommy shook his head. We got hostages, 42 of them. They won't risk killing their own people. Frank pointed at the rooftops, where more armed men had appeared throughout the day. State police, National Guard, sharpshooters. Look at that, Tommy. You think they're here to talk? They're here to kill. The moonlight reflected off rifle scopes. Frank thought about Carlos, probably asleep somewhere in the yard, dreaming of his mother. He thought about all the young ones who'd followed them into this. Tomorrow, Frank said, or the next day. It's coming. We need to prepare people. LD woke Frank before dawn, his face ashen. Quinn died. Last night. The guard, he's dead. Frank sat up, fully awake instantly. Everything had changed. This wasn't just a riot anymore. This was a murder investigation, and every man in D-Yard was a potential suspect. Frank called his security team together immediately. Double the guards around the hostages. Nobody gets near them without clearance. They're going to blame us for Quinn, even though we've protected every guard in this yard since this started. Carlos approached, young face creased with worry. Frank, are they going to charge all of us with murder? For one guard who died during the rush. Frank put his hand on the kid's shoulder and lied through his teeth. No, Carlos. They know we protected them. They know the difference. But Frank knew the truth. To the state, they were all murderers now, and murderers don't deserve mercy. The helicopter appeared at dawn, hovering low over D-Yard. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker. You have 1 hour to release the hostages and surrender. If you do not comply, the state will retake the facility by force. This is your final warning. Frank stood with LD and the other leaders, the deadline hanging in the air like smoke. We put it to a vote, LD said. Democratic. Let the men decide their own fate. They gathered the yard, explained the situation. Frank knew what he should vote. Surrender, save lives, take the punishment. But when his hand went up, it rose with the majority. Continue. They'd come too far, demanded too little, suffered too much to back down now. Frank found Carlos and pulled him close. When it happens, you get low and you stay low. Understand. He gathered the hostages, linking hands with them in a human chain. If we're together, they can't shoot, he told his team, knowing it was probably a lie. The hour ticked away. Frank watched the second hand of a guard's watch, counting down to something terrible. Frank positioned himself with the hostages, creating a human shield of inmates and guards linked together. If the state wanted to shoot, they'd have to shoot through everyone. The helicopter returned, hovering directly above D-Yard. The side door opened. Frank looked up and saw them, CS gas grenades tumbling through the air like deadly rain. Get down. Everyone down. Frank threw himself over 2 guards as the grenades hit concrete and exploded. White clouds erupted, spreading across the yard in seconds. The gas burned Frank's eyes immediately, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't breathe without choking. Couldn't see 3 feet in front of him. Beside him, Tommy coughed violently, his whole body convulsing. Frank pulled Carlos close, trying to cover the kid's face with his shirt. The megaphone voice cut through the gas. Surrender now? Lay down flat. Frank tried to move, tried to get people organized, but the gas was everywhere, in his lungs, in his eyes, turning the world into white blindness and pain. Through the gas, Frank heard the first gunshot. Then another. Then the world became thunder. Automatic weapons fire poured down from the walls. State police and correction officers shooting into D-Yard from all sides. Frank couldn't see where the bullets were coming from, only heard the screaming, the bodies hitting concrete around him. They're shooting. They're actually shooting. Tommy's voice, high with disbelief. Frank pushed Carlos behind a concrete barrier, his body acting on instinct. Bullets pinged off metal, thudded into flesh. The hostages they protected for 4 days, guards wearing inmate clothing who were indistinguishable in the gas, were being shot by their own colleagues. Frank heard one guard screaming, "Stop! We're officers! Stop shooting!" The bullets didn't stop. They tore through the white clouds indiscriminately, and Frank understood with horrible clarity. The state didn't care who died, as long as the riot ended. Frank ran through the gas, stumbling over bodies, trying to save whoever he could. He couldn't tell who was alive, who was dead, who was guard or inmate. A hand grabbed his ankle. One of the hostages Frank had personally protected for 4 days. The guard had been shot in the throat, blood pumping between his fingers. Frank dropped beside him, pressing his hand over the wound, but bullets were still flying overhead. "Stay with me," Frank begged, but the guard's eyes went distant, empty. Frank saw L.D. Barkley stumbling through the gas, blood spreading across his shirt from a chest wound. "L.D.!" Frank screamed, but his friend went down. Tommy appeared beside him, limping, blood running down his leg. Frank grabbed Tommy's arm and dragged him toward a wall. 9 minutes. The shooting lasted 9 minutes, but it felt like hours, felt like forever, felt like the end of the world. Frank lay face down in the dirt of D-Yard, the moment from the beginning, the moment when everything stopped. Blood pooled near his face, Tommy's blood, guard blood, the blood of men whose names he'd never learn. The helicopter thundered overhead. Tommy's voice, weak, big black, "They're shooting everyone." Frank lifted his head, looking around at the carnage. Bodies everywhere, some moving, most still. The gas was clearing now, revealing the full scope of the massacre. He saw Carlos 20 feet away, frozen in terror, visible to the shooters on the walls. Frank made a decision. He crawled toward the kid through the dirt, bullets still occasionally cracking overhead. "Stay down, Carlos. Don't move." He reached the kid and covered him with his own body, waiting for the final shots that would end them both. But the shooting stopped. Eerie silence fell over D-Yard, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the dying. 39 people lay dead around Frank. 10 hostages, killed by the state that claimed to be rescuing them. 29 inmates, shot for demanding human dignity. Strip. Everyone stripped naked. State troopers and correction officers stormed into the yard, faces twisted with rage and victory. Frank stood on shaking legs, watching them force survivors to remove their clothes. Every inmate, including the wounded, stripped naked in front of the bodies of the dead. "Crawl. Crawl like the animals you are." They made Frank and others crawl through mud and broken glass, hands behind their heads. Batons rained down on backs, heads, kidneys. Frank tried to shield Carlos, positioning himself between the kid and the guards. A baton cracked across Frank's spine. Another hit his ribs. He tasted blood but wouldn't cry out, refused to give them that satisfaction. Tommy limped past, his untreated leg wound leaving a trail of blood. "Tommy needs medical attention," Frank shouted. A guard hit him in the mouth. They ran the gauntlet, 2 lines of guards with batons, every inmate forced to run between them while being beaten from both sides. Frank went through, feeling bones crack, skin split, but he stayed on his feet. They threw Frank into a cell already packed with injured men. Blood covered the floor, the walls, everything. Tommy collapsed in the corner, his leg wound dark and swollen, clearly infected. Carlos sat against the wall in shock, rocking back and forth, eyes vacant. Frank slid down beside him, his own body a map of pain. "It's over," Carlos whispered. "We're all dead." Through the cell bars, Frank heard guards laughing, telling their version of events. Inmates slit the hostages' throats. Animals cut them up. Frank's head snapped up. "We were holding hands with them when you started shooting," he shouted. A guard appeared at the bars. "That's not the story we're telling. Who's going to believe a bunch of convicts over state police?" Frank understood then. They weren't just covering up the deaths, they were rewriting history completely, turning victims into villains and murderers into heroes. The torture lasted 2 days straight. They pulled Frank from his cell repeatedly, targeting him specifically as a known leader. In an interrogation room, guards drew a football shape around his testicles with a marker. "Gonna cut these off, Big Black. See how tough you are then." Electric shocks to make him confess to killing hostages. Batons to his kidneys, his joints, his face. They wanted him to sign a confession saying he'd murdered guards. Frank refused. "I protected them. You killed them." Another shock. Another beating. Back in the cell, Frank watched Tommy deteriorate. The leg wound needed antibiotics, surgery, medical care. Tommy got nothing. On the second day, Tommy developed a fever. By the third day, he was delirious. Frank held his friend's hand, helpless. 30 days, Tommy whispered. "I was 30 days from seeing my daughter." Tommy died in that cell, killed by a bullet wound and deliberate medical neglect. Frank closed his friend's eyes and made a promise. He'd tell the truth, no matter how long it took. Word spread through the prison like wildfire. The medical examiner's report was in. Frank sat in his cell, waiting. An inmate passing by whispered through the bars. They all died from gunshots, Black. Every hostage. The throat slitting was a lie. Frank had known it, lived it, watched it happen, but hearing the official confirmation still hit him like a physical blow. The state had lied to the entire world. They'd claimed inmates savagely murdered the hostages, when in reality, state police had shot them during the retaking. Every death, inmate and guard, caused by the same bullets, fired by the same people who now claim to be heroes. Frank thought about Tommy, dead from an untreated gunshot wound while guards partied down the hall. He thought about L.D. Barkley, who just wanted to be treated like a man, shot in the back while surrendering. The truth was out, but Frank doubted anyone would be held accountable. The system didn't punish itself. They came for Frank and the other identified leaders before dawn. Shackled and chained, loaded onto prison transports bound for maximum security facilities across New York. Frank looked back at Attica as they drove away, seeing the cell block windows, the towers, the walls that had held so much hope and horror. 62 inmates were being indicted for crimes during the riot: assault, kidnapping, murder. Frank's name was on that list. They were charging him with killing the very hostages he'd protected, the guards who'd thanked him for keeping them safe. Meanwhile, not one state trooper, not one guard, not one official would face charges for the 39 deaths they actually caused. Frank caught a glimpse of Carlos being loaded into another transport. The kid looked 10 years older than he had 5 days ago. L.D. Barkley would never take another transport. He'd died in D-Yard, shot in the back, his eloquent voice silenced forever. Frank leaned his head against the window and watched Attica disappear, taking with it any illusions he'd had about justice. The trials dragged on for years. Frank sat in courtrooms, wearing shackles, listening to prosecutors claim he'd ordered hostage deaths. His lawyer presented the medical examiner's report showing all deaths caused by state gunfire. Prosecutors argued that didn't matter. The riot itself created the conditions for death. Frank watched guards who'd fired into D-Yard testify as heroes. He watched state officials receive promotions. Not one person who'd actually killed anyone faced consequences. The 62 indicted inmates became symbols of everything wrong with the system, scapegoats for a massacre they didn't commit. Frank learned Carlos got 10 additional years tacked onto his sentence for riot participation. A kid who'd been terrified, who'd hidden behind Frank during the shooting, now serving extra time for wanting better toilet paper and religious freedom. The irony tasted like blood. For years after Attica, prosecutors finally admitted they had no case. The charges against Frank and the other 62 inmates were dismissed. The evidence, what little existed, proved the state's narrative was built on lies. Frank should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt hollow. For extra years in maximum security for crimes he didn't commit, for charges that never should have been filed. Tommy's family sued the state for wrongful death. They lost. The court ruled Tommy's death during a riot was his own fault, despite the documented lack of medical care for a wound caused by state police bullets. Frank's body bore permanent scars from the beatings, nerve damage in his back, hearing loss from the electric shocks, psychological trauma that woke him screaming most nights. Carlos made parole, one bright spot in an ocean of injustice. The kid wrote Frank a letter. "Thank you for saving my life. I'll never forget." 62 inmates had their lives destroyed by false charges. 0 state officials faced accountability for 39 deaths. Frank walked out of prison after 10 years total. 5 for the robbery that sent him there, 5 more stolen by Attica and its aftermath. He stood outside the gates, breathing free air for the first time since he was 16 years old. A car waited in the parking lot. The door opened and Carlos stepped out, now 23, a man instead of a terrified kid. They embraced without words. "Tommy?" Carlos asked. Frank shook his head. Carlos's face crumpled. They stood there in the parking lot, 2 survivors of a massacre the world had moved on from. Governor Rockefeller was now Vice President of the United States, the man who'd refused to negotiate, who'd ordered the assault that killed 39 people. Not 1 minute of prison time. Not 1 night of nightmares. Just upward mobility. Frank made a decision that day. He'd spend the rest of his life telling the real story of Attica, the story the system never admitted. Frank sat in another courtroom, 29 years after the riot. This time he was testifying in a lawsuit brought by Attica survivors against the state of New York. His voice was older, rougher, but the memories were sharp as broken glass. He described the torture, the electric shocks, the football drawn around his testicles while guards threatened castration. He described watching Tommy die from an untreated gunshot wound. He described protecting hostages only to watch state police shoot them. Carlos testified too, finally speaking the truth he'd carried for 3 decades. The state fought them every step, but the evidence was overwhelming. 502 inmates received a settlement, $12 million total. Frank's share came to $4,000, about $10 for every hour of documented torture. The hostage families had previously received $12 million from the state. Frank didn't begrudge them that, but the math told a story. Guards killed by the state were worth compensation. Inmates tortured by the state got pocket change. The state never apologized, never admitted wrongdoing. The settlement came with no acknowledgement of guilt. Frank stood at the Attica Memorial on the 50th anniversary of the riot. He was 71 now, his massive frame bent by age and old injuries. Carlos stood beside him, grandfather to 3. Only a handful of survivors remained. Most had died carrying the trauma of those 5 days. Governor Hochul spoke at the ceremony, the first official apology from New York State in 50 years. The state of New York failed those who were incarcerated and those who worked as prison guards. On behalf of the state of New York, I offer my sincere apologies. Frank listened without expression. 50 years too late for Tommy, he said to Carlos. Too late for LD. But the truth was finally official. The state had killed the hostages, not the inmates. The massacre had been unnecessary, preventable, criminal. Changes followed Attica, prison reforms, new protocols for handling riots, recognition of inmate rights. Every improvement was paid for with 39 lives and decades of lies. Frank "Big Black" Smith died in 2004, but before he passed, he gave hundreds of interviews, testified in multiple trials, became the voice of Attica's truth. His final words on the subject, recorded a year before his death: "We weren't criminals that day in DR. We were men demanding to be treated like human beings. We asked for $1.50 an hour instead of pennies. We asked to practice our religion. We asked for edible food and toilet paper. We asked for showers more than once a week. And for that, 39 people died. The cost of dignity: 10 hostages killed by the people who claimed to be rescuing them. 29 inmates killed for demanding basic human rights. Tommy, who just wanted to see his daughter, dead from a treatable wound and deliberate neglect. LD Barkley, who spoke so eloquently about being men and not beasts, shot in the back while surrendering. Carlos, who survived but carried the trauma forever. Frank kept his promise. He told the truth about Attica until the day he died. And slowly, painfully, 50 years later, the world finally listened. The question Frank asked before he died still echoes. How many more Atticas before we learn that human dignity isn't a privilege to be granted? It's a right that cannot be taken away, no matter how many walls you build, how many guns you point, how many lies you tell. Frank "Big Black" Smith passed away in 2004, but his story lives on. If you want to hear more stories of the men the system tried to silence, subscribe to this channel. Hit that bell so you never miss when we expose what really happens behind bars. And comment below, What other untold prison stories should I cover next? Most people don't know the truth about Attica. Now you do. Share this video so Frank's story reaches everyone.